Hey everyone, Steve the Amateur Historian. How you all doing today? I'm doing, well, could be better, could be worse. I've got another installment in this series of intriguing murder mysteries, disappearances, Jane Doe, John Doe cases that I've been doing as a series, and this one's really interesting to me that I'm going to bring to you today. I mean, they're all interesting, of course, but this one's interesting to me particularly because in addition to the commonly used phrase when it comes to a lot of cases like this, which is there's not really a lot of information out there about what happened, this case seemed to go even further, almost to a point where either just records weren't kept well or lines were crossed, but it seems like nobody really seemed to care about the fact that this particular individual went missing. And I mean, like, there's no evidence that there was even a police investigation into this case. Now, if there was one, that information has not been readily visible to me, and I think that is just absolutely wild when somebody goes missing. Anyway, that said, this is the story of the 1977 disappearance of a guy named Jay Calvin Pringle. So Jay Calvin Pringle was 17 years old in 1977. And in April of that year, he went on a road trip with a friend of his named Robert Kellogg. And it immediately struck me as interesting when you think about the fact that this guy was 17. By all accounts, he was still in high school. And as I understand it, spring break is at the end of March. And here we were, it was mid-April. And Pringle went on this road trip with a friend, and I'm wondering, like, wouldn't he have been missing school, though? Because he didn't just, drive to the beach for a day. He drove all the way down into California. And actually, his disappearance is believed to have happened in California, but what makes it an Oregon story is that he lived in Medford, and he left with Kellogg from Medford going south. And the last time he is reportedly seen is by Kellogg on April 19th of 1977. They'd made it all the way to Gardena, California, which Gardena is a neighborhood right smack in the middle of Los Angeles. It's more or less kind of in the south central area. I think it's really close to Compton, if that kind of narrows it down for you. And as the story goes, these two guys drive into California, end up making it all the way to LA together. And apparently once they end up in LA, they have a falling out of some kind. But it's interesting because the last person, officially, as far as any of us know, to see him alive is Robert Kellogg, his companion in traveling. He says they had an altercation, they had some kind of argument that apparently was bad enough that Pringle grabbed his, suitcase, traveling bag, whatever he had, and just left him. And Robert Kellogg said that that was the last time that he saw Pringle, and he said that he saw Pringle leaving with another man whom he didn't know. The mystery unidentified man whose last seen was somebody who then in turn disappears forever. And it was just very strange, the fact that we have this 17-year-old guy. Now, I don't know how well Pringle knew the LA area. All I know is that he lived in Medford. So, I mean, there's not really a reason to think he knew LA really well. And here he is, he's 17 years old. Even if he's an outgoing, independent, free-loving, I want to go out and explore the world and get myself into some strange situations kind of guy, which I don't know if he was, but even if he was that kind of person that was a little bit reckless, it just seems strange to me that he would travel down to LA. He's like hundreds and hundreds of miles away from home in an area that he probably doesn't know very well. He's not even an adult quite yet. And he just, when the two have an argument, he just says the hell with it and walks away and leaves Kellogg because they obviously traveled by car. And Kellogg took the car because right after this he left and went to Las Vegas. So Pringle walks away and he doesn't have a car to get home. And what's really interesting is when Kellogg leaves, he has Pringle's money with him. It was reported that he had spent Pringle's money. So Pringle leaves this guy. He has no real mode of transportation to get home. And if he's going to, say, catch a bus or something back up to Medford, he didn't have any money with him. And I'm thinking, if these guys are traveling together, why wouldn't Kellogg have his money and Pringle would have his money? Why wouldn't you just have your own money on you? Why does Kellogg end up with Pringle's money? Why would you, in a scenario like that, just give your money to the other person in your group? So it seems the last time Pringle is seen, he's just walking away in an area he doesn't know very well, hundreds of miles from home, and he has no money or seemingly any method, no way of actually getting home. It doesn't make any sense to me, and it makes this Kellogg guy come off as kind of suspicious. Again, he's the last person to officially see Pringle alive, and it seems over the top that Pringle would just walk away and put himself in a dire position being stranded in LA just because they had a little pissy fight with each other. And then Kellogg leaves with the car and the money. And so while, somewhere in the Gardena neighborhood, Jay Calvin Pringle, 17, walks off supposedly with a mysterious unknown man and is never seen again. Again, Kellogg apparently just says the hell with it, gets into the car, drives over to Vegas, proceeds to blow whatever money he has and whatever of Pringle's money he has. And then he ultimately returns to Medford, apparently because he ran out of money. It's bizarre. And if these guys are friends and they're buddies, and Kellogg takes it upon himself to take this guy on a road trip, you think he would at least make some effort to go back and look for him if there's nothing nefarious going on here. But he just drives to Vegas, blows their money, and then goes back to Medford because he's run out of money. Now, it's interesting because obviously by my tone, you probably be noticing I'm very suspicious of this Robert Kellogg guy. Again, last person to see Jay Calvin Pringle alive. But in my suspicion, I find it interesting that he would even return to Medford. And I'm assuming he lived in that area because, how else would him and Pringle know each other, really? It seemed like they probably were living in the same general area. And that's when, the story became revealed. And I don't know exactly how long after he last saw Pringle before he actually ended up back in Medford, and he told Pringle's family, hey, we split while we were down in LA. And I didn't see him after that. And that was when Pringle's mom reported him missing. But again, by all accounts, I could find no information that suggested a real valid investigation was really undertaken. In this case, either by the local Medford authorities or by authorities down in Los Angeles, where they'd say, well, that's the last place he was seen, so technically he's a missing person from the Los Angeles area. But it's just, and the problem is the guy that has a lot of suspicion, and authorities were suspicious of Kellogg as possibly being responsible for the reason why Jay Calvin Pringle went missing in the first place. But they had no evidence on him. Nobody knew where Pringle ended up. The only way that we know where he was last seen is based on Kellogg's own account. We don't even know if he's dead. We don't have a body. We don't have a crime scene. We don't even have verification of a murder or another scenario. Pringle walks off and dies in a mysterious accident. There was nothing. You couldn't even verify that he was dead. And so the authorities could never... nobody was ever probably going to get nabbed on it unless there was definitive proof discovered in probably a stroke of luck kind of way. So Kellogg was never really going... There was no way to really honestly convict him on this, because all we had to go on was his account. And that's the unfortunate thing. It is interesting to note, though, that not long after this all happened, while he'd been living in Oregon before, Kellogg moved away from Oregon shortly after this all happened. I don't know if that necessarily means he fled, because I don't think he moved too far away. But it is interesting that he left town shortly after. It's always interesting when that happens. But the problem of having this potentially sketchy guy, Robert Kellogg, as the last person to see Pringle alive, is we almost have to rely on his account. And his account could be completely, utterly inaccurate. It could be a complete and total fabrication. And based on his behavior, the fact that he just split and then blew all their money in Vegas and then drove home, seems like he didn't give any remote care for the fact that his friend was now stranded in an area that he probably didn't know anywhere, and he's only 17. It seemed like Kellogg didn't really care. So, was Gardena the last place he actually saw him? I personally doubt it. I think that's just the story he gives. The last place he saw him could have been anywhere between Medford and Los Angeles. There's even been a little bit of theorization out there that maybe they went to Vegas together, and Vegas would be the last place that he was seen. I know there was at least one resource. Most resources say Gardena, California, was the last place that Pringle was seen alive. But I know like one or two other sources said that Vegas was the last place he was seen alive. And I don't know why they said that, because I found no other information that would suggest that the two went to Vegas together. Somewhere between Medford and Vegas, these two split. And that's the complication, is, all we have is Kellogg's account. And I don't trust his account as far as I could throw him. And, pretty much once you cross the Oregon border into California, from there all the way down almost to LA, so much of California is open. It's hills, it's the Sierra Nevadas, it's a lot of rural space and a lot of wild animals. There could have been some altercation. Who knows what actually really happened? But I think the much more likely scenario is there was some altercation that was had between the two that was escalated. Maybe there was something, and this is what sucks about the fact that so few details are known about this case. So few details are known about Jay Calvin Pringle in general. Because you contemplate, was there some issue they had before they went on this trip? And was this trip all a ruse on Kellogg's part to get Pringle away and then kill him for whatever reason? It's hard to say what the motive would be, because we don't know what their prior friendship was like, or at least association with one another. But I think it's a much more likely scenario that somewhere between the Oregon border and Los Angeles, either out of a random argument they got into where Kellogg snapped and killed him accidentally, or premeditation, somewhere between the Oregon border and Los Angeles, he drove Pringle somewhere and killed him. And there's so much open space out there in rural California to ditch a body, and so many wild animals to come along and take away parts of it. And here we are, it's been more than 40 years later, and no trace of him has ever been found, which means it's pretty unlikely any trace ever will be. But my best theory would be that Jay Calvin Pringle's remains were left and are still out there decomposing somewhere in rural California, maybe not even too far off of the I-5 freeway. That's kind of where I sit, opinion-wise, on the case. And one kind of lingering possibility, when you think about the fact that most sources say they split in Gardena, California, but then there's this potential idea that the actual split happened in Las Vegas, is I could potentially see, it's risky, and again, I don't necessarily think this happened, I'm just throwing it out there, that, and again, it goes in relation with the idea that all we have to go on in terms of when Pringle was last seen was Kellogg's description of when they were last seen. So it's possible that, let's say, they leave Medford and the ultimate stopping place is in Vegas. Let's say they were never even in the Gardena area. Ultimately, he ended up in Vegas. And Vegas, is either maybe where the murder actually took place. Again, if we're going with the idea that Kellogg killed Pringle, either intentionally or accidentally. Killed him in or near Vegas and maybe buried him, just as much as possible, the rural areas of California. Nevada, outside of Vegas and like Reno, is almost all open rural space with lots of places that go untraveled, except by, again, say, wild animals. So maybe Gardena, the purpose of Gardena is, to me, it is a ruse. It's a way of saying, this is where he was last seen. Oh, and by the way, he left with somebody else. Wink, wink, that person probably killed him. But again, it's the ruse, whether it was somewhere in Nevada near Vegas or somewhere in, Central California or whatever. The idea that, but again, see, because we know Kellogg was in Vegas. So if we know he was in Vegas and say perhaps, he got rid of the body near Vegas and then somehow somebody stumbles onto the body and it's recovered and they say, oh, well, these guys were seen traveling together and we find the body remains near Vegas. We know Kellogg, his last known traveling companion, went to Vegas. You're gonna connect things pretty quickly, and so he could easily say, "Oh, well, we were on our way to Vegas, but I last saw him in California. I saw him way over here when I ended up way over here." So the fact that his remains ended up way over here is just a coincidence. What I'm getting at is Kellogg could have been preparing himself to argue against the evidence, which would show that he was in the same area that Jay Calvin Pringle's remains were found, if in fact they were ever found, which of course they haven't been. And this is where the serial killer angle comes into play. Because again, do we know for a 100% certainty that Jay Calvin Pringle's dead? No. He's also been missing for some 43 years. So is he likely dead? Probably. And usually when people go missing and missing this long, they died not long after they were last seen. And the thing about the time, this is the late 1970s, there was a lot of people in the Los Angeles area who were, riding the highways and abducting and killing people. You had the hillside stranglers who abducted women, so obviously they wouldn't come into play, but you had people like Randy Kraft who would travel the highways in the Los Angeles area, and he would abduct and kill young men, which Jay Calvin Pringle was. He was a young man suddenly stranded in the Los Angeles area in 1977. So some theorize, a guy who's far away from home. For all we know, if the guy has no money, he's probably going to try to hitchhike home. And that was the primary victim types, that someone like Randy Kraft was just this brutal serial killer. Again, always victims of opportunity. He would hit up, gay bars sometimes, but one of his primary things to do was he would pick up hitchhikers, get them into his car, get control of them. And Randy Kraft was killing from 1971 to 1983. So Jay Calvin Pringle's disappearance was right smack dab in the middle of this. And so a lot of people have contemplated if he was one of Kraft's victims. Now, something that people have used to dismiss Randy Kraft as possibly, Pringle being one of his victims, and I'm not 100% against it, but I'm not convinced that Randy Kraft picked him up and killed him. But one of the things that's used to argue against, the idea that Kraft killed him was Randy Kraft had what he called a scorecard. It was this list he had. And so for each victim that he took, he would write some memory trigger on the list, and that was how he regarded his victims. Like, for instance, he killed a couple people up in Oregon because briefly he did work up in Oregon, and I know one of his victims was just literally called Portland. So that could be like a memory trigger for him to remember that particular victim. And nothing on the scorecard really seems to. Of course, some of the notations used, it's hard to know exactly what they're particularly referencing. But there's nothing really to say that really seems to connect with Jay Calvin Pringle. That being said, there was 61 victims marked on this list. And of those 61 victims that are marked, 18 of them are unidentified, which means potentially one of those 18 could be Jay Calvin Pringle. Now, I went through those ones that were unidentified to look through like the notations used, and even then, of those 18, I couldn't find any that seemed like they would really. Some of them were definitely not, but I couldn't really find anything in those 18 unidentified that I could perceivably attach to Pringle. Granted, so little is known of him. You know, there could have been details about his life and his past, things he was into, things he liked to talk about that may have come up, and that could have been what Kraft would use to notate. But still, again, I don't think it's very likely. And on top of that, if you look at his known victims and when they were killed and when they were discovered, Randy Kraft didn't really kill a lot of people. 1977 was, in the serial killer realm, was what you may call a cooling off period for Randy Kraft. So even then, he wasn't really killing a lot of people at that time. I may have to address the notes a little bit while I talk about this because I've got a lot of dates and a lot of numbers written here. But if we are to play the maybe a serial killer is responsible for Jay Calvin Pringle's disappearance, I think, and again, I'm not saying I believe this, I just think this is a more likely possible suspect than Randy Kraft. And that was another guy who mostly targeted young men and boys. Was a serial killer who killed a lot and is kind of not quite as recognized as, serial killers who have a similar victim count. And that was a guy named Patrick Kearney, who killed, I think, somewhere from like the high 20s to like as many as like 35 people. And he was also mostly killing in the Los Angeles area. And here's what's interesting. Patrick Kearney's killings may have even gone as far back as the early 60s. But in the mid-70s was when he was really killing a lot of people. And again, reportedly, according to Kellogg, the last time that Pringle is seen is right there in L.A. on April 19th, 1977. Patrick Kearney's last known victim was killed April 6th, 1977, only 13 days before Pringle is last seen alive. And this victim was deposited in the forest, kind of in the hills north of LA, about 30-40 miles from Gardena specifically. So even his last known victim, shortly before Pringle disappeared, was killed and deposited, right in that, right in that LA area. And Kearney was not finally apprehended until July 1st, 1977. So that means from early April till the very start of July, he was still free. And while his last known victim killed in April 6th, which suggests for the better part of almost the last 3 months of his freedom, he didn't kill anybody, or at least it's not known that he killed anybody, but he would have been right there in LA when Pringle, again, was supposedly dropped off. So, the two could have possibly stumbled onto each other. Again, he was a young man at 17. He would have been something that Patrick Kearney could have potentially targeted. And when understanding Patrick Kearney, it's important to understand that they've only officially, and again, obviously serial killers, many of them balloon their numbers to make them sound more iconic than they actually are, but officially only 25 victims have been attributed to Patrick Kearney, but he says he's killed as many as 35. So if he's telling the truth, which he could be, that's 10 people that are unaccounted for. Could Jay Calvin Pringle be one of those 10? Possibly. I don't know. And he was known primarily to pick up his victims in gay bars. But he would periodically, some of his victims were people that he just picked up walking the roads, hitchhiking, something that, again, I could perceivably see again, if Kellogg's story is true and Pringle's left stranded in LA with no money to get, a bus ticket home or something, he'd probably hitchhike. It was what a lot of people did, especially between Oregon and California. That was extremely common, and that's how a lot of these killers that drove the highways were able to get their victims, is because hitchhikers were so common. And something else that I noted that really distinguished Randy Kraft and Patrick Kearney is Randy Kraft, because again, we have to consider the fact that Pringle's body has never been found. Randy Kraft had a tendency. He was a murderer. He would literally. He was known for murdering his victims and then throwing them from his car while he was driving. I know some of his Oregon victims were found like just along the freeway. Like obviously he'd been driving along and he just kind of kicked him out on the side of the road. Randy Kraft didn't make much of an effort to hide his victims. He left him out there in the open. So that again, if pretty much all of his victims were so easy to find, why couldn't we find Pringle if he's one of Kraft's victims? Patrick Kearney made a stronger effort to actually hide his victims. Again, his last known victim he buried up in the rural mountains north of LA. Could he have possibly buried Pringle in a similar location? Again, if he is his killer, it's possible. So again, I don't know. Again, LA, big place. It would take a lot of, coincidences for Patrick Kearney or Randy Kraft to suddenly stumble onto Jay Pringle in LA. Especially if Jay's objective was to get home pretty quickly. So I don't think, and again, I think he is deceased and probably, as a result of foul play and buried somewhere. I doubt that a serial killer was involved, but if one was, I would say Patrick Kearney's probably the most likely person in that case. When all is said and done, I'm of the opinion that Robert Kellogg killed him. For whatever reason, for whatever motive, he was the last person to see him alive, and who knows what elements of his story are true. That being said, let's play the devil's advocate one more time, and let's just say, for the sake of another possibility, even a much more likely possibility than a serial killer getting their hands on Pringle, is let's say Kellogg's story is true. They're traveling along, they get to Gardena, they have an altercation, they split, Pringle says F you, takes his bag and walks away. Whether or not he's with a mystery man is irrelevant. The fact of the matter is the area that he was left in, he was essentially left in South Central LA, which has, its history of crimes and violence and murders. And if Kellogg's story is true, another angle is it's possible Kellogg could have, again, being in an area he doesn't know very well, he could have stumbled into an area, stumbled down a street, stumbled somewhere that he probably shouldn't have been going. And he could have stumbled onto the wrong people. That's entirely possible too. He was in, or at least surrounded by pretty rough areas in relation to Los Angeles. And, he could have stumbled on to the wrong people there. He could have been taken advantage of, people that, might, anyone who may say like rob you and kill you so that you can't be a witness. They could have, met him and he's like, oh man, I'm not from LA. I don't know my way around here. Nobody knows I'm here. Giving all these cues for someone who might want to kill you to do it because they're thinking they could get away with it. So that's a possibility. Again, if Robert Kellogg's story is true about how they parted ways, and I just don't believe it. I think that story is a complete and total fabrication, and I think he murdered, again, my opinion, I think he murdered Pringle and deposited his body, buried him somewhere in rural California or possibly rural Nevada if we're to go that route. Again, whether it was an accident or not, I really don't care. You killed someone and you didn't take responsibility for it. And you tried to, plant it on this mysterious man that he saw. That alone by itself is just makes me so suspicious of Kellogg. Because that's what people who have something to hide or are potentially responsible for someone disappearing, there's always some story about how they were walking away with some mystery stranger. It's never, I last saw them walking off on their own. You have to add that element of somebody walking away with a stranger, because then it's like, it wasn't me, it's whoever that guy was. What a coincidence. You walk away with a stranger. And of course, it's always an unidentified stranger, because then you're never going to track them down. Probably. I mean, especially if the victim's never found, you're probably not going to find the person that they were last seen with, especially if that person's unidentified. I mean, it was such a standard cover-up story that I can't believe any of it. And I think Robert Kellogg probably killed Jay Pringle. Again, we have so little to go on. So theorization is really, really kind of rough on this whole thing. But that's my perspective based on what little information we have. And it's just so sad that this guy disappeared and his mom reported him missing, but it seemed like nobody in Oregon, California, potentially Nevada, nobody really seemed to give any care at all to figure out what happened to this guy. There's usually at least some kind of moderately extensive search effort, especially after somebody's missing for like 3-4 days, a week, a month. And it didn't seem like anybody, especially in a legal capacity, really cared that this guy went missing. And so, and of course, usually when people go missing, 20, 24, 48, maybe 72 hours, they're usually gone after that. And here we are, we don't even know how long, the space was between Jay Pringle last being seen and when Kellogg finally gets back to Medford and says, oh yeah, we split and I don't know what happened to him. He's a missing person now. By the time he came home and Pringle's mom reported him as a missing person, he was probably dead by then, unfortunately. So it's a real tragic case, because I don't think there's pretty long odds that, Jay Calvin Pringle is one of these guys that just said, screw it, I'm going to start a new life for myself, get a new identity, and he's been living out there somewhere as someone else, and we just think he's dead because we don't know that he's this other person. There's always that possibility, but it's an extreme rarity when people go missing, especially under suspicious circumstances. So that's it. That's all I got on this case. Again, I tried to make as much as I could out of the limited resources there are. Even the few other people that have written, on their blogging sites or whatever about this case, we've all been kind of in agreement that it's strange that so little is known about this case and that it seems so little effort was even made to really solve it. It just sucks. It always sucks when someone disappears. So, all that said, I want to thank you so much for watching this next installment in this series of strange disappearances and murder mysteries and things of that nature. Remember to like, share, subscribe, comment, hit up my Patreon as well, if you so choose. And all that said, again, thank you so much for watching this new installment in this series. Until next time, this has been Steve, the Amateur Historian.